The emergency beacon had been silent for 3 days when Sergeant Thomas Reed finally accepted that no one was coming. The drop pod had crashed hard on the uncharted moon, designation LV-429 in the military databases, but that goddamn rock in the middle of nowhere in Tom's personal assessment. The extraction team should have reached him within 12 hours. After 48, he'd started rationing his supplies. After 72, he'd stopped checking the emergency frequency every 5 minutes. He was alone, stranded, and running out of time. The crash had broken his left leg badly enough that the auto splint in his suit could barely stabilize it. Walking was agony. Running was impossible. And the supply manifest painted a grim picture. Enough water for maybe 5 more days if he was careful, food rations for 3 medical supplies depleted. Tom sat in the shade of his wrecked pod, looking out at the alien landscape. LV-429 was technically habitable, breathable atmosphere, tolerable temperature, no immediately obvious predators. But it was desolate, all rust-colored sand and jagged rock formations that looked like the universe's angriest sculpture garden. The twin suns beat down mercilessly during the day, and at night the temperature dropped to near freezing. He was going to die here. He'd made peace with that on day 4. The alien appeared on day 5. Tom saw her. He was pretty sure it was a her, though alien biology made assumptions dangerous, cresting a nearby ridge. She moved cautiously, clearly injured, favoring her left side in a way that suggested broken ribs or worse. Her skin was a striking orange that seemed to glow against the rust-colored landscape, and her blonde hair was matted with what he hoped was just dirt. She froze when she saw him, those violet eyes going wide with fear or surprise or both. Tom slowly raised his hands, universal gesture for "I'm not a threat," though she probably had no idea what it meant. "Hey," he called out, keeping his voice calm. "You okay?" She didn't respond, just stared at him like he was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. Which, given his size compared to her more delicate frame, was probably fair. Tom made a decision. He reached into his pack, pulled out one of his 3 remaining ration bars, and held it up. Then, moving slowly so as not to spook her, he placed it on the ground between them and backed away. "Food," he said, pointing at the bar. "You look like you could use it." The alien, he still didn't know what species she was, didn't recognize her from any of the intelligence briefings, approached cautiously. She picked up the ration bar, sniffed it, then looked at him with an expression that might have been confusion or gratitude or both. She said something in a language that sounded like wind chimes and water flowing over stones, beautiful but completely incomprehensible. Tom gestured to his own mouth, miming eating. "Food, it's safe. Probably won't taste great, but it'll keep you alive." She studied him for a long moment, then carefully opened the ration bar and took a small bite. Her expression suggested it tasted about as good as military rations usually did, which is to say, like compressed cardboard with a hint of despair. But she kept eating. Tom smiled. "Yeah, they're terrible, but they're calories, and out here that's all that matters." Her name, he eventually learned through painstaking pantomime and drawing in the sand, was Lyessa. She was Thalashan. He recognized the species name when she drew their homeworld's distinctive triple moon configuration. Thalashans were rare this far out in the frontier, usually keeping to their own systems. What she was doing crashed on LV-429 was as much a mystery as what Tom was doing here. Over the next 2 days, they developed a working relationship built on necessity and basic survival instincts. Lyessa had lost her supplies in whatever crash had stranded her here, but she knew the terrain better than Tom did. She'd been here for nearly a week. She showed him where to find water seeping from underground springs in the rock formations. He shared his remaining rations, splitting them carefully to make them last. His leg was getting worse. The auto splint could only do so much, and infection was setting in despite the antibiotics. He could feel fever starting to build, see the discoloration spreading around the break. On day 7, he woke to find Lyessa gone. Tom's heart sank. He didn't blame her. She'd gotten what she needed from him, and staying with a dying human was a liability. It was the smart play. He'd have probably done the same thing. He rationed out half a ration bar for breakfast, knowing it was one of his last, and tried not to think about how much his leg hurt. Lyessa returned 3 hours later, carrying something wrapped in what looked like large leaves. She knelt beside him and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a paste made from local plants. She pointed at his leg, then at the paste, then mimed rubbing it on. Her violet eyes were earnest, pleading for him to trust her. Tom had nothing to lose. "Sure, why not? Can't make it worse, right?" The paste burned like fire when she applied it, and Tom had to bite down on his belt to keep from screaming. But within an hour, the burning faded to a dull warmth, and the swelling around his leg visibly decreased. By that evening, the fever had broken. "You saved my life," Tom said, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone conveyed the meaning. Lyessa seemed to understand. She placed her hand over her heart, a gesture he'd seen her make before, apparently one of respect or gratitude among her people, and then pointed at him. He'd saved her by sharing his food when he was starving. She'd saved him by finding medicine when he was dying. They were even, or maybe they were something more than even. Maybe they were friends. The rescue ship arrived on day 12. Tom heard it before he saw it, the distinctive roar of atmospheric engines that made his heart leap with desperate hope. He activated his emergency beacon, sending up a flare that painted the rust-colored sky brilliant red. The ship landed 50 meters away, and Tom nearly wept with relief as the ramp descended and he saw the Earth Defense Force insignia on the hull. "Sergeant Reed!" Lieutenant Morrison rushed over, her medic team right behind her. "Jesus, Tom, we've been searching for you for 2 weeks. The crash beacon was damaged, kept giving us false coordinates." She stopped, seeing Lyessa standing behind him. "Who's that?" "A friend," Tom said firmly. "She's coming with us." "Tom, she's not human. We can't just—" "She saved my life," Tom interrupted. "I shared my rations with her when I was starving, and she found medicine that kept me alive when my leg went septic. She's coming with us, Lieutenant. That's not negotiable." Morrison looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Tom's expression stopped her. "Fine, but you're explaining this to the captain." The flight to the nearest station took 6 hours. Tom spent most of it in medical, getting his leg properly treated while Lyessa sat nearby, watching the human doctors work with obvious fascination. The medical staff confirmed that whatever plant medicine she'd used had probably saved his life. Another day, maybe 2, and the infection would have been untreatable. At the station, Tom helped Lyessa contact her people. It took 3 days of working through translators and diplomatic channels, but eventually a Thalashan ship arrived to take her home. They stood together in the docking bay, 2 beings from different worlds who'd survived the impossible together. "Thank you," Tom said, knowing she still didn't understand English. He placed his hand over his heart, mimicking her gesture. For everything. Lyessa smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out something small, pressing it into his hand. It was a pendant, carved from some kind of dark stone, showing the Thalashan triple moon symbol. She said something in her language, the words flowing like music. The translator clipped to her collar, provided by the diplomatic corps, rendered it into flat English. "We will meet again, this I promise." Tom closed his fingers around the pendant. "I'd like that." Then she was gone, walking up the ramp to her ship, and Tom was left standing in the docking bay holding a small piece of carved stone that reminded him of the time he'd shared his last rations with a stranger on a dying moon. 20 years passed. Tom left the military after another 5 years. The injury from LV 429 ending his career as a frontline soldier. He became a civilian contractor, training new recruits in survival techniques. He married, had 2 kids, divorced amicably when they both realized they'd grown apart. He built a quiet life on Earth's outer colonies, as far from the politics and chaos of the homeworld as he could manage. The pendant stayed with him through all of it, hanging on a chain around his neck. He'd never forgotten Lyessa, never stopped wondering what had happened to her, whether she'd made it home safely, whether she ever thought about those 12 days on LV 429. He was 53 years old, teaching a survival course to a new batch of colonial scouts when his comm unit pinged with an incoming message flagged as diplomatic priority. Tom almost deleted it. He didn't deal with diplomatic matters anymore, but something made him open it. The message was simple. "Thomas Reed, your presence is requested at the Thalashan Embassy on Europa Station. Matter of personal importance. Travel arrangements and accommodations provided." Tom stared at the message for a full minute before his hands started shaking. 3 days later, he stood in the reception hall of the Thalashan Embassy, feeling distinctly out of place among the elegant architecture and sophisticated diplomats. He was just a retired soldier, weathered and worn, with gray in his hair and old injuries that ached when it rained. "Sergeant Reed." Tom turned and found himself face to face with a Thalashan diplomat, her orange skin and blonde hair immediately familiar even though he'd never met her before. "Just Tom these days," he said. "I haven't been Sergeant Reed in a long time." "Mr. Reed, then," she said with a smile. "My name is Kellara. I'm here to escort you to someone who has been very eager to see you again." Tom's heart hammered as he followed her through the embassy's corridors. They stopped before an ornate door and Kellara knocked softly. "Enter," came a voice from inside. A voice Tom hadn't heard in 20 years but recognized instantly, even filtered through a translator. The door opened and Tom found himself looking at Lyessa. She was older, as was he, her blonde hair now streaked with silver, her face marked with lines that suggested both laughter and burden. But her violet eyes were the same, and when they met his, they filled with tears. "Tom," she said, the translator rendering her language into his name. "You came." "Of course I came," Tom replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "You asked." Lyessa crossed the room and embraced him, and for a moment they were back on LV 429, 2 desperate survivors helping each other stay alive against impossible odds. When she finally stepped back, Tom could see she was wearing something around her neck, a pendant made from twisted metal that he recognized as part of a military ration package. "You kept it," he said, gesturing to the pendant. You kept mine, Lyessa replied, touching the stone pendant that hung against his chest. They sat in comfortable chairs by a window overlooking Europa's ice-covered surface, and Lyessa began to explain. When I returned home 20 years ago, she said, I was the youngest daughter of a minor noble house. No one of importance, no particular prospects. But I told my story, how I had crashed on that terrible moon, how a human soldier had shared his last food with me, a complete stranger, when he was dying himself. She smiled. My people were moved. The idea that someone would give away their own survival to help another being they'd never met from a species they barely knew, expecting nothing in return. It resonated. It became a story that spread throughout Thalashan space. That seems like a lot of fuss over a ration bar, Tom said. It was never about the ration bar, Lyessa replied gently. It was about what it represented. Among my people, generosity to strangers is considered the highest virtue. But generosity, when one is desperate, when sharing might mean one's own death, that is considered sacred. She gestured around the embassy. Because of that story, because of what you did, I was elevated. Given opportunities I never would have had otherwise, I studied diplomacy, rose through the ranks of our foreign service. 3 years ago, I was appointed Thalashan ambassador to the Human Alliance. Tom blinked. Ambassador, you're the... Yes, Lyessa confirmed. I am the chief diplomatic representative of my entire species to yours, and I have spent the last 3 years trying to find you to thank you properly for the gift you gave me. Lyessa, you saved my life too, Tom protested. That medicine you found? Yes, we traded survival back and forth, she agreed. But Tom, you gave first. When you had every reason to keep your rations for yourself, every justification to let me die so you might live a few days longer, you chose kindness. That choice changed my life, and it has changed my people's relationship with humanity. She stood, moving to a desk and retrieving a small case. For 20 years, I have been working toward this moment. I have proposed treaties, negotiated trade agreements, built bridges between our species, all of it leading to this. She opened the case, revealing official documents bearing both Thalashan and human governmental seals. The Thalashan Council has voted to enter a formal alliance with humanity, Lyessa announced. Full military cooperation, open trade routes, cultural exchange programs. We are to be your allies in truth, not just in word. Tom stared at the documents. Because of a ration bar. Because of what that ration bar represented, Lyessa corrected. Because you showed us that humans, when tested, choose compassion. Because in 20 years of diplomatic service, I have never stopped telling your story, and my people have never stopped being inspired by it. She closed the case. But this is not just about politics and treaties. This is about something more personal. Tom, you have 2 children, yes. Yes, Tom said, thrown by the change in subject. Michael and Sarah, they're in their 20s now, making their own way in the galaxy. The Thalashan Council would like to offer them full scholarships to our finest universities, Lyessa said, along with positions in our diplomatic corps if they wish, and for you, she paused. For you, we would like to offer something different. She pulled out another document. A position as cultural liaison. You would work with me, helping to bridge the understanding between our peoples. The pay is generous, the work meaningful, and... She smiled. It would mean we could finally have those conversations we couldn't manage 20 years ago. Tom looked at her, this alien woman who'd become an ambassador because he'd shared a meal when he was dying. Lyessa, I'm not a diplomat. I'm just a soldier who made one decent choice a long time ago. You are the man who taught my entire species that humans are worth trusting, Lyessa replied. That seems pretty diplomatic to me. She reached out and took his hand. Tom, you gave me my future when you shared your last rations. Let me give you one in return. Let me show you what that small act of kindness has grown into. Tom thought about his quiet life on the outer colonies, about teaching survival courses to recruits who would forget him by next year. Then he thought about a rust-colored moon, a desperate alien, and the moment he decided that another being's life was worth more than his own survival. "When do I start?" he asked. Lyessa's smile could have lit up the entire station. "How about now? I have about 1,000 introductions to make, and I've been waiting 20 years to tell everyone about the human who saved my life." 5 years later, Tom stood in the Thalashan Council chambers on their homeworld, watching as the formal alliance treaty was signed. He wore the ceremonial robes of a cultural liaison, but around his neck, he still wore the pendant Lyessa had given him 2 decades ago on LV 429. His children were there, Michael working in the Thalashan Diplomatic Corps, Sarah studying xenobiology at their finest university. They'd both flourished in the opportunities Lyessa had provided, had grown into the kind of people who built bridges instead of walls. "Thank you," Lyessa said softly, standing beside him as the dignitaries celebrated. "For that ration bar, for choosing kindness, for changing everything." Tom smiled. "Thank you for coming back, for remembering, for turning one decent choice into something that actually mattered." "It always mattered," Lyessa replied. "Every act of kindness matters, Tom. Some just take 20 years to show their full impact." They watched the celebration together, two friends separated by species, but united by the memory of 12 desperate days when one had chosen to share and the other had chosen to return. The galaxy was full of grand gestures and political maneuvering, of treaties signed and wars fought. But sometimes, Tom reflected, the most important moments were the smallest ones. A ration bar offered to a stranger, a pendant exchanged between friends, a promise made that transcended language and species. He'd shared his last rations on a dying moon, expecting nothing in return. 20 years later, he'd gained a friend, a purpose, and a future he'd never imagined. Some investments, he thought, paid dividends beyond measure. All you had to do was be willing to share what you had, even when it cost you everything. Especially when it cost you everything.